Hello, Politics and Media 101 listeners. We are back with a new episode. It's been a few days since we recorded the last one. I think even maybe a week or two at this point. But it's been a busy end to the summer for both of us. I myself have moved house. I've moved from Cambridge, Massachusetts, all the way to Boston, Massachusetts, just a few miles down the road, but something that took a bit of my time at the end of the summer. And I know Justin's been having an exciting summer as well, with lots of sports action, a bit of travel. I think you went to Florida, Justin. Is that right?
Yeah, had a great time on the beach in St. Petersburg, so basically Tampa Bay area.
And is it true that Florida is where woke goes to die? And are you eager to make America Florida?
To bring this right back into politics, hell no. I do not want America to resemble much of anything relating to Florida. And it was a rather shock to go from not only a place in Washington, D.C. that's 95% liberal, where even the Republicans that live in the city don't respect or like Ron DeSantis, down to Florida, where he, at least for the more conservative folks, was somewhat of a beacon, an icon, a herald of truth. Florida was very weird in that regard.
Well, we'll see how much longer that lasts. Even in the state of Florida, there's some news reporting that suggests that the shine is coming off of the governor, even in his home state, his base of political support. But we're not here to talk about Ron DeSantis. Why would we want to spend our time talking about Ron DeSantis? We're here to talk about something so much more exciting, which is the intrigue on Capitol Hill the last few days, Justin. And it's remarkable because people like Justin Higgins, who are interested in Congress and the functioning and work of Congress, have been exploding at the recent events on the Hill. It's been like the biggest soap opera or serialized drama television program for people like Justin. This is Game of Thrones, Succession, The Sopranos. And those of us who are not like Justin Higgins might not even know about all of the insanity that's been happening. I've been seeing some reporters saying that the events of the last few days are something that's never happened before, ever, in recent American history. And I think that we do need to bring a Justin, a decipherer, a translator, an interpreter of the congressional news to help the rest of us understand exactly what's happening and why we should care.
Yeah, so John, to put it in the most simple, straightforward terms we can find, it's a breakdown of the governing norms of the U.S. House of Representatives for the party in the majority. And when that happens, that means that aspects of U.S. government cannot function, assuming that there is must-pass legislation coming up, which in this case there is, the funding of the government, which we will get into. But also, when one party that's in the majority fails to be able to do the most simple and straightforward aspects of governing, that puts whoever's the leader of that party at grave risk. And in this case, because it's the House Republicans, Kevin McCarthy's job is certainly at risk right now.
Well, it's interesting, Justin, because it reminds us a little bit of what Congress's primary responsibility is, right? Because as much as social media and the news media talk about the sorts of things we were just talking about at the opening about, Florida being where woke goes to die, the responsibility of government is not to kill woke. It's to provide public services to all of us. And the way that Congress sort of exerts these responsibilities and these powers is through the power of the purse, through spending. The most important thing that the House of Representatives really does is determine how our public resources are allocated, how they're used. And so this fight that's been happening the last few days is about the budget. It's about spending more than it is about anything else, really.
Well, Mike, we just saw yet another defeat for Speaker Kevin McCarthy and a sign that getting out of the government shutdown at this point might be quite difficult. A bill to fund the Department of Defense was expected to come to the floor. This was a procedural vote to move forward to it. McCarthy was going to bring it up last week, pulled it because he didn't have any votes, and then put it back on the floor and dared members to vote against. 5 of them did. And that's all that's needed in a House that has margins this small. The procedure rule has gone down. They cannot move forward on this. At the same point, remember earlier today, they were going to vote on yet another procedural motion to move to that stopgap continuing resolution to keep the government funded at least until the end of next month. That's also currently off the table, although a number of members are huddling in one of the offices, trying to hash out potential agreements on how this can get done. One amendment that we have heard is to put the funding spending even lower. Currently, Republicans were looking at about an 8% deduction for some domestic programs that didn't deal with the military or veterans. Now they're looking for an even lower amount than that. They say they want to get the government back to the amount of spending before the pandemic. But of course, it's a big question on exactly what's going to wind up happening here.
Yeah. One among many big questions. Seems like the fight before the real fight. All right, Emily, thank you so much for the update.
Like you said, our system of government is based on the division of power between three different branches: judicial, executive, legislative. And in one way that this is accomplished is that the president can't just allocate and determine funding willy-nilly. It has to go from Congress. They have to create the funding to the executive branch, basically, for them to spend it in their agencies. The provision in the Constitution says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in the consequence of appropriations made by law being made by Congress. Okay, so we've outlined that is Congress's fundamental responsibility. So how does that impact what is happening right now? So what is happening right now is there are a plethora, 12 to be specific, must pass spending bills passed and signed into law by September 30th for the funding that has been outlined by the authorizations process, which we can get into later, to go into effect for the new fiscal quarter on October 1st. Essentially, if these bills are not passed into law, or one bill or multiple bills that cover all of these different issues, then there will be no funding for a bunch of government programs as of October 1st. So what is happening right now on the House? On the House, you've probably seen that Kevin McCarthy has brought the special rules package for the Department of Defense appropriations to the floor twice, and it has been voted against by certain Republicans in his party, and it has failed twice. Now, this is historic. It really may sound boring and into the weeds, but we need to understand that one of several norms of governing in the House for at least modern history has been, and Kevin McCarthy did an admirable job of outlining this. Basically, number one, when you have a consensus speaker pick, don't vote against them. He already suffered a massive humiliation in that regard. Took him 15 votes to become the leader. Number two is you don't do a motion to vacate, which he may suffer. The second aspect of this. And then the third aspect of this is you don't vote against a rule. So what is a rule? Especially a special rule. So a rule is when you have a piece of legislation that is going to hit the floor through the Rules Committee, they vote, pass out of committee, the guidelines for how that legislation is going to be heard. So for example, you can have an open rule, which means any amendment can be put forth in an open rule. So that's one example of a rule. There could be a closed rule where you have no amendments whatsoever being able to put forth during floor consideration for a piece of legislation. Specifically, there's special rules for appropriations bills. This is very important because a special rule means that the House Rules Committee, which passes the rule out of committee for vote on the full House floor, can create special rules because these are spending bills that violate the otherwise established rules created by the House for that term. So basically, it's like a get out of jail free card for creating rules. These rules are important, and in the last 2 decades, I believe, only twice before this week have special rules been voted against. This week alone, we have had 2 special rules sunk. So all that mumbo jumbo, all that jargon, what does it mean? It means that not only can Kevin McCarthy not bring a bill to the floor and pass that bill through his own chamber, he can't begin to debate a piece of legislation on the House floor because the rules vote is failing. So therefore, he can't even bring a piece of legislation to the House of Representatives floor right now. It is completely and fully paralyzed.
Okay, so Justin, let me see if we've got this straight, and you can correct me if I've got any of this wrong. So we've got 12 spending bills that have to advance, that have to pass Congress right now. This is because the spending provisions are expired from ever the last time they were passed?
Essentially.
So when was the last time that does this have to happen every single year?
Yes, we do have 12 bills that need to pass. It was set up based on the 1974 Congressional Budget Act, where essentially every single year, what is supposed to happen is 12 different bills are supposed to get marked up in the House and in the Senate, and then they're supposed to pass these bills individually. Now, the last thing I'll add here, John, is this hasn't happened since, I believe, 1996 was the last time we went through what is called regular order.
Regular order. Tell me about that, Justin. What's the difference between that and what's happening now?
Yeah, so 1996 regular order, 12 bills, they get passed. What happens now is many of these bills, even in a fully controlled Democratic House or Senate, Republican-controlled House or Senate, they're not even able to get through on party lines. So instead of having one piece of legislation focused on agriculture for appropriations that gets marked up and reviewed, and there's a fundamentally more transparent process because there is months to review this legislation. It's only dealing with agriculture and farm, and you have hearings on it, and you have a lot of time to edit it and mark up the legislation and then implement those edits. What is happening now is essentially a lot of the appropriations, a lot of these 12 bills that we're talking about, for example, transportation, Department of Defense, agriculture, health and human services, almost anything you can think of that with the normal functioning of the government that is discretionary funding has to go through this process. They're not even getting done. So what happens is we reach September 30th or close to it. We aren't going to be able to fund the government in time. So we do a month-long continuing resolution. And then from there, we create an omnibus, typically one or two or a few pieces of legislation where you're putting together these 12 bills. Let's just use a big omnibus as an example. You put all these 12 pieces of legislation together into one piece of legislation. And then you drop that legislation on members of Congress with 24 to 72 hours to read and understand every single aspect of how the government is going to be funded for that next year. And then you force them to vote on that legislation. That is how we have been doing things as opposed to the regular order.
So most members of Congress then in this situation, in this system, aren't getting much of a chance to even read the bill thoroughly, let alone contribute to it substantively. Is that correct?
Yeah. Let's say you have in the House, for example, you have like 7 different staffers that have 10 different policies each. I've been in this part before. I could barely get through the agriculture part of my portfolio, and my portfolio included energy and trade and immigration and environment. And I could barely read the agriculture stuff in time to give my boss a summary to vote on it. So to your point, John, a lot of these people that aren't involved in the authorization, aren't involved on the appropriations committee, are going in blind and just voting the way that their party leadership tells them to vote.
So we've got these 12 spending bills. I mean, you've given us a thorough explanation of how they get made, who's making them, and how the system is kind of meant to work when it comes time to vote. But we're in this situation now where not only are we not able to get a vote on these bills, we can't even vote on the debate. We can't even vote on rules to open debate. I mean, this sounds a little bit like the way the filibuster works on the Senate side, right? Where you have to vote to open debates, and you can shut down the possibility of a bill passing by voting down that opening of debate, that cloture, as it's called. I mean, that's sort of where we're at now on the House side. As far as I've kind of always heard, there wasn't really a problem like that on the House side.
Because
there was no filibuster. Yeah.
This does not happen. If you are a member of Congress and your party is in power in the House of Representatives and you are morally diametrically opposed to a piece of legislation, let's say, for example, hypothetically speaking, you are a pro-choice Democrat and leadership of the Democratic Party puts a pro-life bill on the floor. The standard operating procedure is not to vote against the rule, especially if voting against the rule, your vote would sink the rule. You allow the rule to go, and then what you do is you debate against the bill and work to build coalitions to vote against that bill. We are in relatively, for modern history, uncharted waters. and shows two potential crises depending on your perspective. One being, I don't like to do this, but I'm near certain there will be a government shutdown. So that's one crisis. The second crisis is I don't know how this ends with Speaker Kevin McCarthy keeping his job.
So we've basically created a filibuster in the House. That's kind of what's happened, right? So let's talk about the people that are making this happen, the people who are objecting not only to the bill, but on the rule to open debate. I mean, how many of them are there? And what is the nature of their objection, even on the idea of opening debate?
Last Wednesday, the first time this rule was shut down, there were 5 members of the Republican Party that voted against it. It was Dan Bishop, Ralph Norman, Andy Biggs, Matt Rosendale, and Ken Buck. Notice you don't see Matt Gaetz' name. What has happened since then is McCarthy, Wednesday night, after the rule was voted down, tried to negotiate with these folks. He was able to negotiate with these folks, and he thought he flipped enough where he could bring the bill back to the floor. However, Wednesday night, one of McCarthy's supporters, Mr. Donald J. Trump, tweeted that he opposed a continuing resolution. So partly as a result of this, you had another 5 on Thursday vote and sink the rule. However, there were 3, and this is very, very important. There were 3 that voted the same way on Thursday as they did Wednesday. It's Andy Biggs, Dan Bishop, Matt Rosendale. And then there were 2 new ones, very likely in part due to Trump, Eli Crane of Arizona and Miss Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. It's a little bit different group of folks. However, what I take from this, because Marjorie Taylor Greene's basically going to essentially side with McCarthy almost regardless, and her opposition was based on Ukraine aid being included in the bill. She does not want Ukraine to get another dollar from the United States, was that of the people that we've mentioned, putting Matt Gaetz aside, you have 3 ardent haters of Kevin McCarthy. It is Andy Biggs, Dan Bishop, and Matt Rosendale.
So McCarthy can lose, I think, 4 Republicans if he wants to pass something, right? That's what the math is. It's 218, 214, something like that, right?
Yeah, and that depends on like all the Democrats showing up, all the Republicans showing up. The math is variable, but that's roughly true.
So theoretically, he can lose those 3 haters, but he's got to carry everyone else along. And you've identified what some of the objections, at least Green has with the bill. Do the others have substantive objections to the content of these bills? We're talking about how these are some of the most important things that the U.S. government does. I'm wondering if the people who are voting, not to open debate are really objecting to it on substantive grounds, or if there's something else going on here.
So, John, it's nearly impossible to read people's minds, but we're going to give it a go here. I think that there are 2 tranches of objectors that we could basically create. One being those that flip their votes Wednesday from a no to a yes. So folks like Ken Buck. Another being folks like Tim Burchett, who claim they are currently against a continuing resolution, which is really what Kevin McCarthy needs to work to keep the government open. Those folks, I believe, have principled objections. Namely, they want to get back to regular order. And then some of these folks want to have a continuing resolution. So that's a bill that keeps the government open for 1 month, basically just continuing to fund it at previous year levels. Instead of funding it at 2022 levels, which is 1.7 trillion, they want to cut back to pre-pandemic levels, which would be $1.47 trillion. So those are one group of objectors. The other group of objectors, I got to say the Biggs, the Bishop, the Rosendales, the Gaetz, for example, they just are freaks who want to use this opportunity to create a crisis and get some media attention.
I mean, these numbers, Justin, they're extraordinary. And I think that it's really pretty much impossible for anyone to get their head around them because there's no other number in the world that's comparable. I mean, there isn't a bigger entity in the world than the United States federal budget, really. So it's hard to look at these numbers and really make much of them because we have so little to compare them to other than other years in, U.S. Fiscal spending. So we've got $1 trillion, 1.4, 1.7, what have you, $1 trillion on the table here. And these members are looking to hold up, even a discussion about how it's going to be spent. What I'm wondering is, what about the role of the Democrats in the House? Because if we're only talking about a rule, if we're only talking about opening debate, I don't really fully understand why you can't get the votes that you need by having Democrats vote to open debate. I mean, that's not even a vote on how the money is being spent. It's just a vote to move a little bit forward on the process here. So why is it that when there's 435 members of the House, 3 or 4 of them are able to stop you from even starting a discussion about what you're going to do with the money?
So I feel like we need to play I'm Just a Bill right now, because everything I just explained, John, is just messaging legislation that the House of Representative Republicans are trying to get through. So to answer your question really short, why would Democrats help Republicans open up a rule on a completely partisan bill that is completely against almost all of their values? The end game here for the Republicans isn't to pass a piece of legislation that can be signed into law. It's to just be able to pass a piece of partisan legislation that can then accomplish 2 things. Number one, they can say, hey, we've passed something out of the House, and they can try and blame the Democrat-controlled Senate, which will likely not work based on history of polling and shutdowns. And then number 2, the more pragmatic aspect is, once you pass something through, you can do some kabuki theater, and the Senate can send something back to you that is more viable. But that being said, there is no incentive for the Democrats to help McCarthy, because right now, what McCarthy is trying to do will not inherently keep the government open or these programs funded.
So, I mean, the House has their responsibility to pass some kind of budget, and then the Senate also have their responsibility. We're not really hearing much drama about what's going on in the Senate as far as the budget goes. We're hearing some other Senate drama this morning, the indictment of Bob Menendez, but we're not hearing so much drama about their budget process. I mean, have they moved along and passed the equivalent of what the House is grappling with right now?
So I'm a creature of the House, and it pains me to say this, but the Senate, which believe themselves to be the adults in the room, are acting like the adults in the room. And Senator Schumer is working with Senator McCarthy to create bipartisan legislation that they can begin to work through the process. So they are beginning to do that in the Senate. And anything that comes out of the House will be drastically different, because you need to get over the filibuster in the Senate. So it will have to be a bipartisan bill. Now, we mentioned that the procedures of governing have basically been thrown out of the window in the House. This is important because this is not a constitutional mandate. However, it's basically been this way for most of our existence as a country, that spending bills originate in the House. That's just like a norm and how it's typically done. So what could very well happen here is the Senate can create the bill that's going to be viable and ultimately used to fund the government for a year. The Senate can pass the bill through their own chamber, and then the House can insert that language through a process known as an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Basically, they take a piece of legislation, they remove everything but the number of that legislation and the title. They replace all of the text with the Senate legislation. They pass that through the House of Representatives. But because it's originating in the House, then the Senate, which had already passed it in a different form, legislatively and parliamentarianly, what has to happen is the Senate will then vote again on the legislation and pass it. And that's the most likely thing to happen for either a CR, is some very complex process where basically you're taking the Senate legislation and pretending it's the House legislation.
I mean, you'd have to think that something that's able to get through the Senate would be palatable to a majority of people in the House, right? Because the Senate is sort of a conservative institution that has a slim Democratic majority. So that seems to match pretty well with how the House is composed, doesn't it? Because you've got almost half of the House are Democrats, and then a very large portion are people who are really fed up with the way that the obstructionists are behaving on the Republican side. What I mean is many of the Republicans are in this kind of exhausted cohort, which is the majority of the Republican caucus itself, and are eager to avoid a shutdown and to, get a win for McCarthy and get something passed. So they would probably be pretty happy with whatever the Senate put together, wouldn't they?
Yeah, but John, they have McCarthy between a rock and a hard place where what's happening now is he is either going to find some way to make the conservatives cave. And in doing so, there's likely to be a lengthy shutdown. And at least in the immediate term, Republicans will suffer in polls. So Democrats can get a polling boost if there's a shutdown, even if McCarthy is able to keep his speakership. What's a little bit more likely than that is he would lose his speakership. And it would just be utter chaos. Eventually, the new speaker would be able to pass something because the person that becomes speaker wouldn't take the job otherwise. We have precedent for this. Or the third thing that could happen is McCarthy could work with Democrats. And in essence, what Catherine Clark said, a very senior member of the House today, they would want, disaster relief and Ukraine funding, like robust Democrat numbers. They would want bipartisan budget bill, another major extraction concession from McCarthy, and they would want the Biden impeachment inquiry to be closed. So Democrats can either gain politically from this shit show going on, or they can gain legislatively and in turn politically because of the impeachment trial being shut down. So they have no incentive to help McCarthy out because also, John, let's be real, there aren't really too many consequences for a government shutdown for the overwhelming majority of Americans. Most won't even know it happens.
So we'll get into that a little bit later. We'll talk about what happens if the government does shut down. We're kind of going to project what's going to happen next year. But you mentioned you characterized the obstructionists, the holdouts on these bills as conservatives, and I mean they're really not conservatives very much, are they? I mean they're not dedicated to institutions. They're not really working to try to advance conservative policy goals. They're more creatures of the media. They're more people who are interested in kind of throwing rocks into the process and obstructing the process, right? I mean, it's very different from what you would consider to be kind of a conservative, someone who's interested in kind of keeping the ball moving and the institutions and the tradition of the Congress. They're, like you said, they're creating these unprecedented situations in Congress, which is quite, it's not really what we think of as being conservative in that sense, in the small c sense. But you mentioned the impeachment inquiry, and I kind of wanted to bring this up because I remember the context of when McCarthy made this announcement that he was beginning a so-called impeachment inquiry of President Biden. And my interpretation was that it was really very connected to this problem that we're discussing now, this problem with the spending bills, because it seemed to me as though this announcement, which didn't really have much substantive effect, was mostly just done to try to placate these obstructionist members and get them to vote for these spending bills. I mean, is that correct? Is that how you see it as well?
Yes. The impeachment inquiry was opened to try and quell and assuage the fears, the anger, the concerns from these malcontents. I call them conservatives because, I mean, I don't know. Why not? The Republican Party is not functioning right now. What is a conservative, right? I mean, I don't even think that it really has a definition anymore. Maybe these more right-wing members. But that portends another issue here, John, and that is that their demands are constantly shifting. And the reason is, number one, they are not good faith actors. Number two, they are not team players that put party, never mind country first. They don't even put party first. Number three, the motivations for a lot of these folks, for example, Bishop from North Carolina, Rosendale from Montana, and Matt Gaetz from Florida, they all potentially want to run for statewide the next cycle or two elections. That would be like lieutenant governor, senator, governor. So ultimately, they see this opportunity to gain media attention based on the slim majority that Kevin McCarthy has, the weak and feckless nature of his just persona, but also how he has gone about governing the House. And the fact that it's a government shutdown. The media loves to blow up a crisis and make it seem bigger than it is. So if they were to self-manufacture a crisis, you would have a compounding effect where the media would be covering them 24/7, and these handful of holdouts are the ones responsible for it. So they're going to get all the media attention they can desire. That helps with grassroots fundraising from your most conservative Tea Party activists that actually support them for shutting down the government, because in their minds, it's something conservative and noble. But also what it helps is name recognition in the state. And the third thing it helps is, and why these people are incentivized to do it, despite all, being in federal elected office, and one could even argue part of the establishment, Gaetz seems to think he's close with former President Trump, who was the leader and is the leader of the Republican Party, which would be the establishment. It allows them to set up a fight against the current Speaker of the House for the Republicans, which in turn helps them manufacture a perception or keep a perception going that these folks are indeed outsiders instead of establishment figures like some of them maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we often use conservative as a proxy for right wing, whether or not that's correct, kind of like how liberal was often used as a proxy for left wing, even though that's really not a correct use of that term. People are moving away from that. But even describing these members as more right wing, I'm not even sure if that's accurate or not, because I can't really tell if their policy goals in this situation are even more right wing than what the leadership of the Republican Party in the House is looking for. I mean, you've described how the Republican Party in the House put together this big messaging bill. They're talking about the impeachment inquiry and all of this stuff. They're putting out all of this right-wing virtue signaling. And Gaetz and some of the others still want to obstruct that. I mean, I don't know if they're pushing for a more right-wing outcome or if their agenda in this is really just disconnected from policy.
I think I do know.
Government
it's
outcomes.
The latter. I don't think they have any policy.
Yeah. Well, I'm tipping my hat a little bit in that direction, I think. But with that in mind, I have to kind of conclude that McCarthy's big announcement that he was opening a supposed impeachment inquiry was really a big flop, right? Because if the goal of making that announcement was to try to get these members back on side, it's clearly failed. They've continued to obstruct this budgetary process. So the whole, theater of an impeachment inquiry, which got a news cycle out of it and got a lot of people outraged, I mean, it really accomplished nothing at all, because if its primary purpose was to get Matt Gaetz to vote for the continuing resolution, it didn't achieve that.
Well, taking Kevin McCarthy's perspective, I would argue that he probably tells you, well, John, it's always darkest before the day. And what I would tell Kevin McCarthy is it's always darkest before the end is the accurate statement here, in that the impeachment inquiry was most likely set up, John, to keep it at 4 or 5 discontent. Because if you don't do the impeachment process inquiry, that gives, Gaetz is really the ringleader here. Gaetz, Rosendale, the other antisocial megalomaniacs that are trying to just grind our process down to a halt. It gives them more ammunition that will resonate with grassroots voters, that will get those grassroots voters to call into other House Freedom Caucus members and then put pressure on those House Freedom Caucus members to flip and vote against the rule with these freaks. So I would say that in a way, the impeachment inquiry was a form of triage, and you could make the argument, because of the dissenters are so few, that it may have worked in large part.
Joining us now is Colorado Republican Congressman Ken Buck. Congressman, thanks so much for being with us. 2 days ago, you said that the time for impeachment is when there's evidence linking President Biden to a high crime or misdemeanor. You said, quote, that doesn't exist right now. Do you still feel that way tonight?
I have not seen any evidence that links President Biden to Hunter Biden's activities at this point. I will be getting a briefing later in the week. I'm looking forward to understanding more of what the Oversight Committee has uncovered. But at this point, I have not seen that evidence.
So Speaker McCarthy certainly doesn't have to hold a full House vote to authorize the impeachment inquiry, but he has always said that he would. He said so 2 Fridays ago. Is it clear to you what changed other than, the threat from the Matt Gaetzes?
Yeah, what changed is that he doesn't have the votes, Republican votes, to pass a resolution to open an impeachment inquiry. They have been trying to get those votes. I don't believe they have the votes.
So why is he doing this?
Well, that's a great question. Why is he doing it? The three committees, the Oversight Committee, the Judiciary Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, are investigating. And they're investigating Biden's activities. They should be investigating. They're uncovering interesting information. Like I said, they haven't found that link yet to Joe Biden, if it exists. But what Speaker McCarthy is doing is he has President Biden on the one hand, President Trump on the one hand, who is demanding that the House open an impeachment inquiry and begin an impeachment of President Biden. And on the other hand, he has spending bills that are coming up, and he needs the support of members of the Republican conference to help get that continuing resolution passed and appropriations bills.
Yeah, I mean, in your opinion, does this impeachment inquiry take away from focus in the House on government spending and avoiding a shutdown?
I believe it does, and I believe it was a shiny object from the beginning, and I think it was a mistake to start talking about the impeachment inquiry. I think it's a good thing that we aren't voting on it on the floor, because we've got a lot of work to do if we're going to pass a continuing resolution by September 30th and avert a government shutdown.
I think that McCarthy is someone who is very short-termist, and we've talked about this before when we discussed all of his issues trying to become Speaker of the House. He tends to make decisions that are only looking 10 feet forward rather than a mile or 10 miles. And he gets himself in these sticky situations because of decisions that are made on that basis. I mean, we've talked a little bit tonight about how he's partly created this situation because of promises that he made to these members trying to get them to vote for him as Speaker. And somewhat predictably, a few months later, he's stuck in this pickle. I kind of wonder if he's going to be in the same place with this supposed impeachment inquiry, because he's announced it without having a vote, knowing that he didn't have the votes to start a formal inquiry. So maybe he gets one or two marginal members to vote for his spending bills on that basis, but what's he going to create a few months down the road? They're going to have to decide whether they're going to vote to impeach the president. And if he doesn't have the votes now to open an inquiry, he's not going to have the votes then to impeach, and he's going to end up in a quite embarrassing situation where they've done this theater and made this big announcement of opening an inquiry, and it will end with them deciding not to impeach, which to any observer looks very much like a vindication of the president and quite an embarrassing failure on the part of the Republicans. I mean, they're creating this expectation that they're going to have an impeachment, and it won't end up happening. And that's because of this short-termist approach that he continues to take.
John, I agree. If they do vote to not impeach, which obviously can be spun to acquit President Biden, it would be massively embarrassing. However, like you said, Kevin McCarthy's only thinking 10 inches in front of his face, foot in front of other foot. But also the other thing is, based on what you said, how embarrassing it would be for the Republican Party as a whole, there is a prevailing thought among McCarthy and his leadership that embarrassment alone may be able to get moderates who would oppose voting to move forward with the actual impeachment trial of President Biden to flip. Additionally, when you are Speaker and you have vulnerable members come to you, there are a couple other things you can do. Number one, you can give them more money for their reelections, and you can promise them money, basically outright bribe them. You're not supposed to do this, but you can. And then the other thing you can do is you can go to your little deformed, ugly, disgusting pit bull in Marjorie Taylor Greene and have her go set up conservative primary challenges to these folks. Now, you're probably losing the House if you do that, but you may be able to coerce them into voting for the outcome that you want. So I think that is to say, McCarthy saw no path forward without the impeachment inquiry. With the impeachment inquiry, he could live another day. And there is, however reasonable or not, a logical, explanation to how they could potentially get to a yes vote.
What you're describing is also a death trap for McCarthy if he's thinking long-term as well, right? Because you're describing a situation where credible primary challenges to loyal Republican Party members become possible, leading to the creation of more Matt Gaetzes in the House of Representatives, which makes it harder for McCarthy and people like McCarthy to hold on to power as Speaker. So again, if you take the long-term outlook, it's a terrible situation that he's set up and created. But if he's looking only a few feet in front of him, maybe there's some tiny marginal benefit, but even on those terms, not very much, because they still can't pass these spending bills even after doing it.
He's not thinking long-term. I don't think he ever has, outside of when he resigned from attempting to become Speaker back when I was working in the House. He thought, well, that this opportunity will come around again. I'm young and I'll be able to advance at some point. But I personally think that Kevin McCarthy is not only blinded to long-term thinking, not only blinded to logic, he is just so much power over everything that he's forgetting history. He's forgetting what caused himself to resign from running for Speaker originally. And I just point you to this quote. This was Wednesday or Thursday after the vote. Kevin McCarthy said, quote, and folks, this is completely false. He said, quote, "This is a whole new concept of individuals that just want to burn the whole place down," McCarthy said on Thursday. Now, for him to say that after he was one of the top lieutenants and deputies and trusted confidants of Speaker John Boehner, there's our first John Boehner mention.
John Boehner. John Boehner has come up in an episode of Politics Plus Media 101. It's remarkable. And we got there a little earlier than we did in the last episode too.
This time it's germane though. For Kevin McCarthy to say that this is a whole new concept of individuals that just want to burn the entire place down, despite having lived through John Boehner having to basically resign because he had a bunch of individuals that wanted to burn the whole place down and not pass a debt bill or a spending bill, is absolutely insane. They say insanity is repeating yourself over and over and over again, despite the process not working out the first or second time. That's what you have McCarthy doing here. Boehner termed these people in his own book 6, 7, 8 years ago legislative terrorists. McCarthy was in on that type of messaging. So I think that he is just at a point where he is breaking down in front of our eyes. He's either now just lying willy-nilly, where his brain is just in such a defensive mode where he's paranoid, he's just lying to say anything that he thinks sounds good, or he's legitimately blacked out and forgot the last decade of United States politics.
Do you have a name? Is there somebody else, or you said theater? Or are we
I think there are a few folks. Look, we have a lot of talented members. Right now our number 2, Steve Scalise, we're all praying for, hoping he gets better because he's getting some treatment for blood cancer. Yep. So I don't want to prejudge his condition, but we've got a lot of really talented people. Our whip, Tom Emmer, is someone who has a lot of credibility across the Congress. He's the number 3. So look, the issue is Kevin McCarthy purposefully backed us up against the wall where government funding was running out and we hadn't passed single subject spending bills. So we're now trying to do work to correct the failures of Kevin McCarthy.
But it sounds
like
you.
Is there anything specific about McCarthy? Because if McCarthy is removed as Speaker, it's not going to be Matt Gaetz who ends up as Speaker. It's going to be someone kind of similar to McCarthy, someone like Patrick McHenry, Steve Scalise, probably not Scalise now because of his health issues, but it will be another Republican institutionalist, someone else who's probably part of the leadership setup already. Stefanik, I don't know. Why is it that McCarthy is such a fixation for Gaetz? It seems personal.
It has to be personal. And to put a fine point on what you said, Gaetz floated Emmer as a replacement for McCarthy, who's more moderate than McCarthy. And to be very clear, whoever takes over for McCarthy, the way it worked when Ryan took over for Boehner, unless they are as dumb and power hungry as McCarthy, which I think that there are few people like that in the House of Representatives, which is shocking to say, they will create a deal where they have centralized enough power and they've passed enough of the tough legislation to pass that it'll be easy sailing for them, at least to and through the next election. So whoever comes in is going to be okay. Very likely. That's how these things work out.
In fact, it's hard to imagine anyone else making as many concessions to the Matt Gaetz of the world as Kevin McCarthy has. In a way, he's the best speaker that someone like that could even ask for, because he does end up giving them whatever they want. And another speaker, a Ryan or a Boehner or some of these other people that are in leadership now and could take over, I mean, they probably, if anything, being less accommodating, because it'd be difficult to be more accommodating. But
and there is clearly some type of personal animus. I don't know. There's speculation that it's McCarthy not shutting down an ethics investigation into Gaetz. But it obviously starts well before then, because Gaetz hated McCarthy during the first 15 votes, and it's very clearly personal, and to the point where Gaetz is floating a much more moderate member of Congress to replace McCarthy as speaker. So it's very clearly personal. I believe that Gaetz said McCarthy's lying like a dog. There's a quote. I don't know. My guess, John, is it's projection. Maybe Gaetz looks at McCarthy, sees a pathological liar who's extremely weak, yet tries to play tough and sucks up to the president because he thinks that not only does he need to, but it's his way to power. And Gaetz is looking in a mirror and he doesn't like the image. So maybe there's some projection and self-hatred going on there. And I think that you could probably, project that out to Bishop and Rosendale too, who are bona fide and unequivocal freaks themselves.
Well, we've talked a lot about McCarthy's penchant to kick the can down the road, which is part of how we've ended up in this situation, thinking near term and kind of delaying a lot of important decisions or critical moments. And that kind of does bring us to where we're at right now as we're recording this discussion, because we're here on Friday evening talking about this. And the last thing we heard was that McCarthy was shutting down the House a little early. I think that they ended all the debate and they closed on Thursday and sent everybody back to their districts. And they're going to pick this up again next week. Justin, do they gain anything out of taking a break? I mean, most members don't stay in Washington on the weekend. They go home to their districts. And, I just want to say that I know that there's kind of a perception out there among much of the public that when Congress isn't in session, the members aren't in DC, they're not working. And that's not always true. A lot of members are doing constituent meetings and important work when they're in their districts. But what it does mean is that they're not really working on this. What kind of benefit do they get out of closing down early and trying to pick this up again next week?
So not everybody went home. I'm not going to bore everybody with the parliamentarian machinations of what's happening, but essentially they do gain. McCarthy's hoping they gain everything from taking this break, because what's happening is the Rules Committee and the others are working full speed to get these 12 appropriations bills ready to hit the floor when they return next week, to then vote on those and hopefully pass those bills from their perspective, so that is one less objection you have from these holdouts. So they're trying to do everything in their power to get to a semblance of normal order and reduce the number of holdouts. That's their goal.
So do we think that there's a prospect for this all kind of coming to an end and resolving itself next week when they get together? I mean, what's the outlook? At the time that this gets released, this discussion will probably be ready to kind of see some more voting again. So what do we expect is going to happen?
I don't know. I mean, sure, they can resolve it in the short term. They can pass the appropriations bills, and Republicans and McCarthy will try and act like it's momentum, and they've done a great thing. But there's a few things we need to remember here. There's no way that they're going to get these bills signed into law before September 30th or October 1st. So that's one issue. The second issue is to get anything through the Senate, it needs to be bipartisan in nature, anything whatsoever. So even if they do get the Department of Defense rule through, and then all of these different appropriations bills through, and then the conservative CR through, the House will have to, at some point, to avoid or end a government shutdown, they will have to vote on legislation that funds the government and gets through the Senate. So what does that mean? That means Democrats are going to have to vote with Republicans to carry legislation across the finish line. Once that happens, that's when McCarthy very likely gets served a motion to vacate. And that's when Democrats have the decision, do we vote with these 5 to 10 to 15 to 20, who knows, however many it will be once McCarthy caves on a Democrat-run CR, to oust Speaker McCarthy? Or do we vote with the overwhelming majority of House Republicans to protect Speaker McCarthy? And at that point, I mean, I personally, John, don't see how the numbers work out where McCarthy is able to team up with Democrats on a spending bill. That's crazy talk. But also, in doing so, shuts down the impeachment inquiry and still has enough establishment Republicans around to support him for speaker, where then they could rely on 150 Democrat votes. Like, I just don't see how the math works out in any real world. So at the end of the day, I think the most likely result is McCarthy loses his job.
You're saying now, and we were talking before about how some of these obstructionist members in the GOP side might be looking at cooperation with Democrats on these bills as a red line. That would be the thing that would trigger their motion to vacate, to remove McCarthy as speaker. And to me, it just seems so ridiculous because the Republicans only have one piece of the legislative puzzle anyway. It's not possible for them to pass anything without working with Democrats in some way, because the House is only 1/3 of this legislative triangle. You've also got the Senate, which is controlled by Democrats, and the White House, which is controlled by Democrats. So whether or not you get Democrats in the House voting for your bill, you need to work with Democrats somewhere along the line, because you have to work with the Democratic Senate and the Democratic White House to make something into a law. So the idea that that would be a red line, that would be the litmus test for whether McCarthy can remain as speaker, seems nonsensical. And it's also probably pretextual. And there's probably, just like we've been saying, an interest in removing McCarthy for some other reason, because it's nonsense to say you can't work with Democrats on anything while recognizing that the Republicans only have one of the three pieces of the legislative ballgame. But what I kind of am wondering, and I mean, this is kind of, I think, the big question here about how the House is currently functioning, and you kind of hinted at it when you're describing this mathematical issue, is that the Republicans, they don't functionally have a majority in the House at all, do they? I mean, they don't actually have a legislative majority, because if they've got this group of members that are not committed at all to having a Republican speaker and are actually interested in opposing even Republican Party messaging, propaganda stuff, just because they can't abide by the Republicans having the speakership, then you don't have a Republican majority. What you've got are a minority government of Democrats, maybe, where they're the largest party in the House, and there is no majority, because these members just seem so committed to opposing Republican leadership that they're effectively not part of the Republican caucus.
What you have here, John, is 5 to 10 members, each holding a loaded gun with Speaker McCarthy as their hostage. And not only that, there's no hostage negotiators that are actually working on behalf of McCarthy's well-being. So at the end of the day, we are in a situation where you have the hostage takers pointing the gun at Kevin McCarthy's head, and we're just counting down for when that gun is going to be fired. This, like you said, it's their end game. They want to scalp. It's a lot of, I guess you'd say, Machiavellian tendencies. I don't want to give them credit, but it's like just dirty personal gain is what they want out of this. I just don't see a way out of this for Kevin McCarthy.
I mean, what it reminds me of is not John Boehner, but Theresa May a little bit, where she had an election in 2017. This is the Prime Minister of the UK at the time. She lost her majority, and so she had to rely on a third party to keep her in the premiership, to keep her in number 10 Downing Street. And that party of only 6 members from Northern Ireland, they were able to obstruct her entire agenda because she didn't have a majority. She didn't have a government without their support, and they needed specific things on the Brexit policy that her own party, the Conservative Party, couldn't resolve. So the puzzle couldn't come together. The math didn't work. We're kind of in a situation like that, right? Where we've really got these 3 parties in the House, the Democrats, the Republicans, and then this group, the group that don't want the Republicans to be in power and do not want the Republicans to have an effective speakership. And that prevents the Republicans from just doing these basic tasks that they need to do to keep the government open, like passing these spending bills.
Yeah, John, and I remember you and I now, oh man, probably 8, 9, 10, 11 months ago on an episode, we were theorizing about how this would all play out. We said the debt ceiling, we said it could default, and this would potentially be the most likely instance of default, but because it's so serious, we're likely to get through it. However, we will have a government shutdown. And in part, I remember saying, John, that if you give the Democrats the opportunity to have another slim majority in the House heading into a presidential election in 2024, or to give the Republicans that slim majority, the Democrats would probably want the Republicans to have that slim majority because of everything we are seeing right now in this handful of people. And to your comparative politics, it sounds similar to Theresa May's situation without knowing nearly as much as you do on this. The reason why I do come back to Boehner, though, is, and this is fascinating to me, I think that if he had the slim majority that McCarthy has now, he would have faced the same exact thing. And I say that with very good confidence because my boss would have been doing this shit. He would have been sinking the rule. He would have been riling people up, and he probably would have been able to get 4 or 5 with him. Now, why this is so fascinating and what insight it gives us is Boehner and McCarthy approached these two factions in polar opposite ways. Boehner kicked them off of committees. Boehner tried to snuff them out by trying to have primary challengers, well-funded primary challengers, trying to get the corporate world against these people, calling them legislative terrorists, waging basically a war against them in his own party to try and just tamp down this insane extremism. McCarthy has done the exact opposite of all of this. He's tried to breathe life into them by making all of these concessions, treating them nicely, bringing Marjorie Taylor Greene into his inner circle. There's so many more different examples, letting Paul Gosar get away unscathed for racism and, everything. But what does it show us? It shows us that at least in this Republican Party for the last decade now, there is a handful to 2 handfuls of complete malcontents that are legislative terrorists, and that there is nothing that can be done to prevent them from shaking the boat and overturning the boat in a simple majority without these people getting their scalps, without getting their head for the trophy wall. And that is a very scary thing because right now the stakes are relatively low. It's just discretionary programs that don't endanger life or property or the functioning of our government. And Ukraine aid will still be going per the DoD, and there's a lot of different exceptions. However, this could come at a very serious point in time, and we could default, or some other thing could happen where these yahoos decide to act up. So this is something that the only way that it can be prevented and resolved in the future is not vote Republicans in, or if Republicans do get in, they get a large enough majority where they can ignore these people.
So I think, we're talking about the stakes. We talked about a little bit about what the stakes were earlier this year when there was the risk of default. You said that the stakes here are a little bit lower, but I think that we should talk a little bit about what will actually happen if the government shuts down, which is a possibility if this isn't all sorted out somehow or the other, probably with Democratic votes next week, or at least, by early October. The government shutdown. This is something that used to be unheard of, but has started becoming, unfortunately, frequent. We had one during the Obama presidency and one during the Trump presidency. I think a lot of the listeners probably do remember it. But Justin, tell us about what actually happens during a government shutdown. What does the government stop doing that it would do ordinarily? The public sector.
The largest material impact is that 800,000, roughly the estimate for this potential shutdown, 800,000, a little bit more maybe, federal employees will not get paid. So there's some legislation passed where they'll get back pay eventually, some of them. Basically, contractors and just nearly 1 million people, John, that work for the government to try and make this country great and strong and work, will not get paid, and many of them will have to go into work. So if you're living paycheck to paycheck in Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, the Maryland area, then maybe you can't feed your family. And that is a real world consequence. But in the grand scheme of 50 million people, 1 million people is not necessarily enough to prevent this from happening based on the way that politicians calculate things. So that's number one. Number two, what happens is basically the customer service arm of the government shuts down. So, for example, the people going in to work for the member of Congress or for your federal agency are essential personnel. They are the ones who are needed to be in the office so that the office can carry out the constitutional requirements. So that means the folks answering your phones, the folks responding to the letters that you write to members of Congress, the folks that are helping you apply for disability, apply for whatever, veteran affairs benefits in these congressional offices, are very likely to not be at their job. And the last thing here that's rather interesting, there's two things. The third thing is, if it's a very lengthy shutdown, and this will really matter at the beginning of next year, what will happen is the Farm Bill programs that were created in 2018 will expire. So that means no crop insurance. So hypothetically, in the worst case scenario, no CR, we're shut down for months on end, you could have food prices spike 5-10x. And then Americans begin to starve because the farmers would take the brunt of the losses and so on and so forth. That's very unlikely to happen. The fourth and last interesting part is we mentioned those 1 million people roughly that won't get paid, potentially kids starve. Members of Congress will get paid. There's almost nothing they can do to circumvent it. And it's because of language in the 27th Amendment, which basically says Congress can do nothing to change their pay in between elections. So what does that mean? That means that this Congress cannot pass a piece of legislation without violating the Constitution that changes their pay from now until November. What they could do is they could pass a piece of legislation that changes the pay for next Congress. It could say future government shutdown, members of Congress don't get paid. So because Congress is getting paid, yet other employees aren't, and it's in the media all the time, and it shows that Republicans can't do anything. They can't do the bare minimum. What you're going to have happen is massive populist political blowback on the ground level. Now, whether that goes from October 23 to November 24, I doubt it, but that's going to happen.
So, yeah, it is interesting to kind of put this in context, because when you hear government shutdown, it sounds quite appalling. But, thinking about how much of the, federal system in the United States is kind of mandatory and isn't going to close down if this happens. You hear about the national parks closing down, but the U.S. military, the border control, these sorts of things will remain functioning. And thinking back on the other recent shutdowns that we had, if you ask people to name 30 things that they remember from the Trump presidency, I do wonder if the government shutdown would even come up. It was a time with an incredible amount of news, and the lasting effect and the lasting memory of that incident, even though it was the longest government shutdown in U.S. history at 35 days, it hasn't left a huge impression. But, thinking about the stakes as they are, 800,000 federal workers now receiving pay. I mean, I'm from a family, of a federal worker. My father was a federal worker for 30 years, and my entire time growing up, 8 people in a family, and that was our source of income for a long time. And that matters. And these are people who are dedicated public servants who are generally nonpartisan, who are working, for the United States, and through no fault of their own are going to be withheld their pay because of, Matt Gaetz and petty squabbles inside of Congress. Something that I noticed in the last couple of days was a story, I think it was in Politico, about a bipartisan effort on the Senate side. I think it was Senator James Lankford, Republican, and I'm trying to remember who the Democrat was. I think it might have been Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, our original home state. They've put forward a proposal to make government shutdowns illegal and make it so that the current funding will just carry on if members of Congress can't come to an agreement on this. And I think that this has been at certain times in American history the way that it did function, and it's possible that they will set up a rule like this so there's no government shutdown and reduces these risks. But what I can't help thinking is that it seems like again and again we're kind of putting bumpers or training wheels on Congress, and we're trying to alleviate these risks by making it impossible for them to fail. And I wonder if we are, in a way, pushing Congress more into this kind of performative, infantile direction that encourages them doing these kinds of stunts because they know that there isn't much of a risk. And for people, including people like Matt Gaetz, for example, who complain that the executive has too much control and that the bureaucracy, the administrative state has grown too much. I mean, part of the reason that's happening is because Congress aren't using their authority in a responsible way or even asserting it. And the more silly Congress gets and the more kind of bumpers and training wheels we have to put on Congress to prevent things like this, the less authority Congress really has in the system. And if Congress really wants to, serve its role as a co-equal branch, they have to take their responsibilities seriously.
Yeah, they should do their fucking jobs. They should pass the House Appropriations Committee and Senate Appropriations Committee, both are which guilty, should pass these damn 12 bills. There should be transparency in the process. Legislators should be able to read and know what's in these bills over the course of several months. There should be open hearings. This is a talking point of Republicans, which they clearly don't believe in, but it's actually a legitimate talking point that the government should function like it's supposed to. It's not. Added transparency so the public knows what's going on tends to bog down the process and make things less likely to pass. So when you have bills with billions of dollars in them and you want a transparent process, it's a recipe for disaster. So I think that to spin this positively, I think that one aspect that can be taken from this is it is an anomaly that this happens. It's only happening because there is an extremely slim majority, and that the majority of these malcontents, which is a handful of folks, are going to run eventually at some point for statewide elections in freaky states like Montana and Florida. North Carolina is a good state. But those two states have some weird Republican voters. So I do think that this is a little bit of a perfect storm. I think another thing to look forward to is you have Donald Trump coming out against this, and Trump's big supporters are, coming out against it. If he is roundly beaten and the Republicans in the House lose 20 or 30 seats, and by some miracle, Democrats are able to keep the Senate, it will put Trumpism to bed. If not with the elected officials or wannabe elected officials, with the donor class, you would have to think that they're just not going to continue to throw money away. Like Ken Griffin, billionaire, recently said he's not giving any more to Ron DeSantis because DeSantis is a loser. This is loser mentality. This is not building coalitions. This is not making sure trains appear on time. This is me, and the majority of normal people in this world don't appreciate that, and it doesn't resonate with them.
As we close, I just want to say that we love all states in the United States, and Justin's, incendiary comments about the state of Montana do not in any way reflect the editorial position of this program. Montana is a wonderful place. My sister said it's her favorite state in the country. And yes, it is true that they elected as governor a person who body slammed a reporter from The Guardian. They've also had a history of electing people from the other party, including their current U.S. Senator John Tester and their recent governor Steve Bullock.